Hi, and welcome everybody to our local environmental health forum. We are looking forward to some updates from our partners about some of the efforts locally for a healthier watershed community. So I'd like to welcome Sarah Greenfield with DEQ. She will be giving an update on the cleanup efforts of the Armstrong property, and then Megan Christian will be presenting on OHA's Healthy Fish Consumption Program, and Nolan Cochran. Did I pronounce that
Cochran.
incorrectly? Cochran,
Cochran.
okay.
hmm
And then it will be presenting on Columbia County's TMDL program. So Sarah, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Sure, thank you, Rochelle. Appreciate the introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. How's that look?
That looks wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to participate. My name is Sarah Greenfield. I am an engineer in DEQ's cleanup program, and I'm the project manager for the Armstrong site. And so we thought we would take this opportunity to provide an update on some of the cleanup work that we are doing, with the goal of getting into construction on a portion of the site here in 2026, conducting an interim removal action measure, which is really focused on addressing some of the highest levels of contamination that we have at the site. So before we jump in, I also just want to acknowledge that I have a great team that backs me on this project. My project peer at DEQ is Katie Doherty. And then we have a consultant team. This is our state consultants, led by GSI Water Solutions. And we have Dalton Olmsted and Fuglovand, who provides engineering support, and then Lodic Solutions, who provides permitting expertise. And this presentation is actually adopted from one of the most recent annual project update meetings that we had with our tribal partners back in November. So it was pretty lengthy and detailed. I did try to cut it back, but bear with me. I know we only have about half an hour for this piece. Feel free to jump in if I'm running long or if we go too deep, but there is kind of a lot to cover. So first I was going to provide just an overview of the project, since it's been, I think, several years now since we've provided an update to the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. Summarize our approach to this interim removal action measure that we are planning, walk through the planning steps and project schedule. And then I also wanted to highlight a couple other separate things that we have going on related to the project, some Wapato tissue sampling, as well as some updates to the fish advisory, which I think will lead in really nicely to the presentation that Megan will be giving next. So project overview, you all know where the project is. These are general orientation slides. Of course, it's right here in St. Helens, in Scappoose Bay. Zooming in just a little bit more, the property, the former Armstrong property, is about 200 acres. And the area that we're talking about for the interim removal measure, or IRAM, is about 15 acres, and it's that area shown in yellow. And just as a reminder for those who haven't been tracking this, or maybe this is the first time you're hearing it, DEQ divided the site into two different, what we call operable units. And this is really just an administrative tool to break up the reporting and remedy selection associated with different areas of the site. So operable unit 1 is what we call the upland OU, and that is approximately 38-acre portion of the site where those former fiberboard operations were. It was formerly owned and operated most recently by Armstrong World Industries, and this area is currently being redeveloped for use as a data center and battery storage area under new ownership. This area has already been cleaned up. Essentially, the whole site has been capped to protect future site workers, and that remedy was implemented back in 2019. So what we're really talking about now is the remainder of the site, and that is what we call OU2, or the Lowland In-Water Operable Unit. And this includes the periodically submerged lowland and in-water areas that surround the upland, including McNulty Creek to the west, which is to the bottom of this screen, and Milton Creek to the east, which is at the top of the screen. And the IRAM is just a 15-acre portion of OU2 that we are targeting for cleanup as kind of a first phase of work. The site was historically used for fiberboard manufacturing dating back to the 1930s, and as a result, there is widespread contamination of site soil and sediment. DEQ did oversee a remedial investigation and risk assessment for the site back in 2015, so that work was completed, and it identified that there are kind of two different categories of contaminants of concern. The first being metals, primarily arsenic and mercury, and the other being organics. And mostly what we're talking about is dioxin furans. Those are one of the key drivers at the site, but also to a limited extent, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs and total petroleum hydrocarbons. All of these were associated with the former operations at the site. And the highest concentrations of contamination that we have found are located near some former outfalls that historically discharged from the upland into the wetlands. And you can almost see that in this historical photo from 1962, which is why I like this photo so much. You can kind of see the natural dispersion of wood chips and wood waste materials from that have been stockpiled and stored and managed in the upland. And then you can see these kind of channels that have formed, winding their way through that wood waste from the outfall discharges. And so that's kind of the overall like conceptual site model for this site, is that we had contamination getting in the wetlands and then dispersing out through these channels, which is why it's largely focused in this area that we've identified for this IRAM. So unfortunately, in 2016, the responsible parties at this site declared bankruptcy. And so all work that we were doing to clean up the lowlands stopped. While that bankruptcy was underway, DEQ put in a claim for the cleanup. And in the end, we ended up with $77 million with which to do this work. And we finally received that money in 2021, which really kicked off the planning for this IRAM. And so we're choosing to move forward with this IRAM because we've had this site in our program since I think 2000. It's been a really, really long time. And contamination levels are pretty high. And so by pursuing an IRAM, it's a way that we can expedite cleanup to get the work done more quickly and in a really focused manner. And so under this mechanism, we envision having cleanup of this area completed within 5 years versus what would typically take 10 years or more if we tried to do the rest of the operable unit, so the rest of the remaining site. It also allows us to make better use of the funds that we have available. $77 million sounds like a lot of money, but this area, because of the wetlands and the tidal inundation and these really soft soils that we're working with, it's really technically complex to work within. And so this is going to be an opportunity to gain a lot of information on how to work in this area that can then be applied towards the rest of the site. And also allows us to really use our monies as efficiently as possible, because as many of you know, costs for construction have gone up rapidly since COVID. And so this allows us to provide some more certainty in what we can accomplish with the funding that we have available. So again, this is kind of a zoomed in version of the area that we are targeting for removal. It has the most widespread and significant contamination. It also has the most significant depths of contamination across most of the site. A lot of the materials were deposited at the surface, and so it's pretty shallow. Here, it does extend several feet down, so that's another reason to really go after this area. We also have found the largest presence of wood waste here. And wood waste kind of acts as a sponge to absorb contamination, and it also can be toxic in itself. Um, and this area also has some benefits in that it's scalable. And so as we kind of work through the design process and we figure out what this is going to cost, we can adjust kind of the boundaries of this to match the funding that's available. And we've split it into 4 different sub areas because there are kind of unique conditions and settings associated with each of them that will drive the remedial strategy. So sub area 1 is the large yellow area. That's kind of the core focus where we're really looking at contamination removal down to about 3.5 feet, and it's about 12 acres in total. Then we have sub area 2, which is the green sub area along the upland boundary. That's a pretty steep shoreline where there's not a lot of opportunity to lay back a bank or do a lot of removal. So we're really focusing there on stabilization of that bank. Likewise, the sub area 3 is along a former pier structure that went out to the Scappoose Bay Channel. It's heavily rip-wrapped. It also has some debris and miscellaneous old, pieces of the facility remaining there that's going to get cleaned up, and then also focused on stabilizing it so that that doesn't present a recontamination source to the completed removal in sub-area 1. And then we have sub-area 4, which is along the riverbank. There's kind of this natural divide here, and an elevated strip of land that separates sub-area 1 from the rest of the Scappoose Bay Channel. There are pretty widespread impacts in that area as well. So that area will be removed to the extent feasible, laid back, and then stabilized to prevent any kind of recontamination. I also just wanted to share some of these historical photos because I think they're very telling in terms of what might guide our future restoration efforts at the site. Because as you can see in this photo from the 1930s, which was very early in the industrial history of this area, there was a lot more water. There was log rafts being floated into the site, and there really wasn't a lot of vegetation present. And so this photo kind of captures what we believe to be kind of some of the more original natural elevations for this area. And then as you progress through time, here's a picture from the 1970s. You can see that water levels or elevations of the sediment and soil in that area have started to go up, and you can start to see a little bit more vegetation coming in. And then if you zoom to today, this is a drone survey that we did back in 2019. You see a lot of vegetation. We have large trees, we have willows, and so it's quite a different condition than it was many, many decades ago. So some of our design objectives are, of course, to remove the contamination and the wood waste, but also to come up with a design that's going to restore ecological function. That's really important. We know that this is a really unique and special site, and we want to preserve that. And then we want to make sure that once the area is clean, that it doesn't get recontaminated. And finally, making sure that whatever we do doesn't preclude our ability to come back later and finish the cleanup and select a remedy for the remainder of the site. So this is really just the first phase to get some immediate risk reduction, but there's still going to be a site-wide remedy needed. And then in terms of how we kind of identified this area, we do have chemical-based thresholds that we're using to kind of guide where we do our removal. And those are based on 2 indicator contaminants of concern, arsenic and dioxin furans. And so we kind of have delineated essentially hotspot areas to go after. And those are the areas shown in red and orange. And then we also have identified the areas of wood waste. So combined, putting those two layers together, we've identified the areas to target in terms of the lateral extent of the work, but also removal depths. And so I just have a photo here in the bottom right to give you a sense of kind of the typical wood waste that we've seen at the site. And as you can see from that core, it's pretty extensive. We do see some pretty thick layers of wood waste that will be included in this removal. Another thing that's kind of guiding the work is acknowledgement of kind of the existing habitat and ecological function. So the majority of this area is considered a wetland. Subarea 1 is intertidal. And while we do have several desirable native species, we've got wapato and bulrush and willow, as we were talking about earlier, just right before this meeting, there is significant reed canary grass growth. And so that's something that we will be considering in terms of what our final elevations are going to be for this work so that we can encourage the natives, but also try to discourage those invasive species. And then from a permitting perspective, we also need to meet two key habitat goals. One is no net fill, so the volume of material that we remove needs to be greater or equal to the volume that we fill or place within this area. So that's important to make sure that we avoid the need for compensatory mitigation. And then the second key component of this is making sure there's no net loss. And so we want to make sure that the existing habitat and ecological function is restored to at least equivalent to what's already there, but ideally better than the conditions prior to implementation of this IRAM. So again, that helps avoid the need for compensatory mitigation and streamlines our permitting process. So to achieve no net loss, we'll be looking at the ability to preserve native wetlands, remove invasives, and reuse trees on site to the extent feasible. So next I was going to jump into the approach, how we're actually going to do this work, which has been a huge challenge because of the fluctuating water levels, the really soft soils. It just makes it very hard to do work in this area. So while this area is technically below the ordinary high water mark, it is very difficult to do using any kind of water-based equipment. So that has necessitated the need for us to use land-based equipment like excavators and trucks. And that means that we will be constructing haul roads throughout this IRAM area so that we can have equipment get out there to remove the material and then bring in clean material to backfill where appropriate. And so this figure here just shows you a conceptual layout of these different roads that will be traversing across the area. And at the end of the work, there will then be a plan to breach these roads and deconstruct them so that they can be used to help to create some habitat complexity to support revegetation and replanting. But the main kind of components of the work are going to be to excavate the contaminated material and backfill, and then to incorporate some slope stability and erosion protection measures, provide source control, make sure we don't have any sources from the upland coming into the lowland, and then managing any debris that needs to be removed to support the IRAM. And then here we just have kind of a conceptual rendering of these haul roads, because I feel like when you hear haul road, that sounds kind of ugly and not great. But the way that we have worked with our permitting folks and restoration folks is to come up with a way that we can create stream channels where we're doing removal and then provide substrate for planting across some of these haul road areas so that we can create sunning areas for turtles, incorporating some wood structures, and then planting things like willows. And so at the end of the day, by deconstructing some of these roads and creating that complexity and these network of channels, we're hoping that it will create a more naturalized effect. And then we are using these recommendations that are in our design documents to target what those elevations are that we should be shooting for. And so for each of the different types of habitat present, we've documented the target elevations for those and have identified the elevations that we want to avoid so that we can discourage the invasives. So this is kind of our framework that we will be using to guide the ultimate leaf surface elevations during construction and design. And this just gives you kind of a cross-sectional view of what that looks like. The line going across the page is the current topography of the site. And you'll see that because we're doing an excavation down several feet, at the end of the day, our goal would be to substantially lower those elevations. So there'll be more shallow water habitat, more intertidal channels. And even where we do have some of these haul roads, many of them would still be below what the current elevations are at the site. So again, we're going to try to achieve our no net fill, no net loss. We're going to be working in some steep transitions to discourage those invasives and increase habitat for salmonids, the western painted turtle, the northern red-legged frog, and then provide some bulrush and wapato elevations conducive to growth of those species. And then we're looking into the reuse of some of the trees that we remove for sunning logs and to add some habitat complexity. And at the end of the day, we're hoping that that will help improve wetland function by increasing tidal exchange and obviously making sure that we are allowing for fish ingress and egress so that we don't have any kind of stranding of fish as part of this work, which is not just part of the finished condition, but we're also obviously thinking about that carefully in terms of how we sequence the work during construction. So then in terms of the IRM planning and project schedule, we do have a new owner in place in the upland. The purchaser is going under the entity title Upland Data Center LLC, and they plan to develop the site over the next couple years. And so DEQ entered into what's called a prospective purchaser agreement with the new owners, which really ensures that DEQ has access to the upland to the extent needed to facilitate our work in water. And it also makes sure that the owner does not do any kind of development or work in that area so that that lowland wetland area is preserved for the remedial action cleanup work that needs to happen, but also any future conservation or restoration opportunities. So that's something that will be revisited once we have selected a final remedy for the site. But for now, no work can be done unless it is approved by DEQ within that lowland in water operable unit. So if you've been by the site recently, you may have seen there's quite a bit of demolition going on. They removed the old factory building and there will be more work happening. And so DEQ is working really closely with the new owners to make sure that our two different construction projects are compatible and not at conflict with each other, because there will be a lot going on at this site over the next few years. And so working through that access with the property owner, thinking through transportation routes, these are all really important site coordination aspects that we are working through. And all of these considerations are being wrapped into a series of design documents that are currently underway. We have a 75% design deliverable, a 95%, and then 100% design package that will be prepared. And that will be used to support the permitting that's necessary for this work, and then also to go out for contractor procurement. Um, and all of that will need to consider the construction timing. As many of you know, there's an in-water work window that we need to consider. We can only work between July and October. So all of this schedule is largely being driven by needing to get the work done in time for the next in-water work window. And then once that is completed and we've done construction, there will be post-construction monitoring as well. And then we will be looking at using the information from this IRAM to inform any kind of follow-up remedial action that might be needed, and to select a remedy for the remainder of the site. So what that looks like in terms of the project schedule, is that we are currently in remedial design for the IRAM. We started in 2022 and will continue through the end of this year, with the 75% design package expected in March, and then the final design expected in July, and then we'll go out for contractor procurement. And that should set us up so that we can have our first year of construction in 2026, starting in July. We do think this is going to take a couple years to complete. So we envision there will be a second season of construction in 2027. So with that, I didn't know, Rochelle, how you wanted to handle questions. I was going to move into a couple other topics, the Wapato and the fish advisory, but I can pause if there are questions on the IRAM, if you'd like.
We typically hold all questions until the end, but we do have a pretty small group today. I'm not sure. Did anybody have any questions on this first part of Sarah's presentation? I guess my only question was the trucking and haul routes within that site, if there would be sanitation of the tires or considering just like invasive seed dispersal, but then it looked like most of the routes would be then under that tidal area or that elevation. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so all the trucks are going to have to go up to the upland where there will be a wheel wash and there will be gravel and kind of all the standard construction best management practices in place to make sure that we don't have anything tracking off the site. So definitely that's something that we are thinking about, and we'll have to meet kind of all those standard conditions that any construction site will have to meet. So yeah, good question though. That's definitely something that's on our mind.
Thank you. All right.
All
I
right.
think you should just lead into the next part of your presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. The next couple will be quick. I just wanted to put this out for awareness more than anything. Um, so the other thing that we have going on right now is that we are planning a Wapato tissue investigation. This is, something that we've heard from the tribes is really important as a traditional food source, and we have quite a bit of Wapato that grows at this site, which makes it unique. Um, and so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has worked with a number of tribes to conduct studies of Wapato at other sites, including the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge Complex and the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge Complex. And so we were approached to see if we could do some similar work for our site that could be used in conjunction with the studies that have already been done. And so really, we thought that was a great idea. And so the objective for this project is really to help understand the uptake rate of our site contaminants into the Wapato itself, and to inform, restoration of the Wapato areas post-construction completion. And so we've identified 9 different areas for sampling. And they're largely just based on where we have Wapato, how well it grows, and the contaminant concentrations in those areas. So we're really just trying to get a whole gradient of representative data. And then we're also getting a background location at the Wapato Access Greenway State Park. So we've developed a work plan for this and have shared it with the tribes for input. And then once we have all that input and it's being finalized, then we are planning to conduct that work next year. And then the results will be shared with those tribes and used to evaluate post-construction restoration conditions. So we haven't done this type of work much at all, but it does seem like something that is happening more and more as we understand how contaminants uptake into different types of vegetation. So I think this is going to be really interesting to see those results and see what it means for kind of future uses of this site in the future. And then the last thing I wanted to just touch on is the fish advisory. So many of you are aware that a fish advisory was issued for Scappoose Bay. And so while we are doing all of this work to do cleanup, the fish advisory really is a critical interim institutional control to protect people who may be fishing from this area. So we have started to work with OHA to conduct some outreach and start drafting some fish advisory materials. And we would love to get input. We have shared this with the tribes that we meet with regularly, but we're also interested in getting feedback from community groups and others on, how people are fishing, where they're fishing, what they're eating, where signage would be most effective, and really anything that would be useful to help us improve the effectiveness of this as an institutional control. So Megan's going to talk a lot more about that. I won't steal her thunder, but I just want to acknowledge that, for now, that is kind of the key way in which we are protecting people. So it is an important part of our cleanup work. So that's all I have for today. I guess I will open up one more time and see if there are any questions on those 2 pieces.
Sarah, do you know if there's been Wapato sampling at all in like that area in the past? Or is this kind of the first instance of that happening?
Yeah, it's definitely the first for this site. The only other Wapato sampling I'm aware of are those other studies that I mentioned from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But that doesn't mean it hasn't been happening. I know there's been a lot of discussion around areas at Sauvie Island. I don't know if there's been any actual sampling, but I would be interested if folks are aware, because I think that data set would really be useful if we can look at it comprehensively and not just on a site-by-site basis. So yeah, if you know of anything, let me know.
And I'm not familiar with any of our other partners talking about Wapato sampling. It'd be interesting to talk about some potential other areas because the bay has a really large Wapato density in other parts, not just at that site. And then yeah, I haven't heard anything on the island either.
Yeah, the only thing I know is that I think folks from the Columbia River Crossing were also approached to do some sampling for Wapato and was asking if we could collaborate. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think there is a signal that there's a lot of interest in these data wherever we can get them, and it seems like that it's getting some traction. So I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't more sampling efforts being planned separately from this one. So I guess I'll just close with, I know the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council does a lot of restoration work in this area, and you all are way more knowledgeable. I'm just an engineer. I don't do this for a living. And so we've had you all out to the site long time ago. If there's interest in collaborating or helping to inform this work, we would certainly welcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we should continue to have this conversation. And again, we were also approached by the new landowner during the negotiation process of buying. So now that that seems to be over, we'd love to help in any way that we can. I know that we're going to work, like I mentioned prior to the start of this meeting, with the Soil and Water Conservation District, with some spurge laurel efforts this spring and summer on that site, as well as any of the other efforts. I'd love to talk about the continued effort to bring down that large population of canary reed grass, and there is beaver activity on that site, as well as a lovely oak upland that is very dear to a lot of the community's heart. So any way that we can be in support or continue to spread the message and to promote this work is excellent. So,
Thank you.
and with that, we'll move into Megan Christian's presentation.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for so wonderfully transitioning into the fish advisory work. Apologies, I'm used to Teams, so just give me a second on Zoom here. Right, can everyone see my screen?
That looks fantastic.
Lovely. Okay, hello everyone. I am Megan Christian. I'm here representing OHA and specifically the new Healthy Fish Consumption Program at OHA. It's a new program as of August of this year. The purpose of the program is to just manage all the fish consumption advisories throughout the state. And I'm happy today to talk to you all about what healthy fish consumption looks like in the Multnomah Channel and Scappoose Bay. So a big reason why we talk about fish consumption and knowing what fish are healthy to consume and which aren't is because obviously what you put in your body and your diet is important. And it's particularly important maybe for people who are having a direct impact on either the development of another human being, so folks that are pregnant or might become pregnant or breastfeeding, or also for small children who are in those periods of rapid development as well. And oftentimes, if contaminants are consumed by specifically these groups of people, it can have a higher risk of health effects from those contaminants. And so fish advisories are put in place to protect the health of the whole population. But we always like to call out these groups of people because these are the folks that are most at risk. But while consuming contaminated fish does have risk of certain health effects, I always like to highlight at the beginning of every presentation that fish are good for you to eat. They are really healthy. They're delicious, in my opinion. That's contested between some people. But they're great sources of, lean proteins full of vitamins and minerals, low in fat cholesterol. They have those omega-3 fatty acids that are really good for you. Really great for brain development, both for younger folks and also as you age. And so they're kind of this superpower food. Fish are also just good for people, oftentimes like families and communities will use fishing as a way to get outside or spend time together. People will have lovely memories fishing with family and friends. It can be an important part of cultures, whether as a food source, so an important cultural thing for people to eat, and also as an activity. Here in Oregon, certain fish populations like salmon and lamprey are important first foods for tribal nations and tribal members. And so I always like to laud the great parts about fish as well. And I'm here today to just, how can we eat fish in a healthy way? And that comes with understanding your local fish consumption advisories. I always like to go over, the basis of what a fish consumption advisory is. It's not a thing that people talk about a lot or are aware of unless you have like a really high profile advisory in your area. And so the first thing is that fish advisories are not laws. These are recommendations that we at the State Public Health Department make to keep people safe and protect the public's health when there are harmful chemicals present in fish tissue. We always like to say that fish advisories are not the end goal. The great work that Sarah and the folks at DEQ are doing is the end goal, right? Like cleanup of the site. But unfortunately, that cleanup takes effort and time. And so in that in-between period, we have the fish advisory to protect the public's health. These advisories usually kind of recommendations come in two flavors. The first is a recommendation to just limit consumption, and then we'll recommend the amount of fish that are okay to consume to avoid any risks to your health. And that means there are some contaminants in the fish, but they're still okay to consume in that limited amount. And the other would be a do not eat advisory. And these are our most serious ones, and they're not that common, but we'll issue a do not eat as advisory if there are so many chemicals and contaminants in the fish that they're not safe to eat in any amount. Fish advisories often have a lot of details associated with them, and it can be difficult to like communicate about them because it's not like a straightforward, easy message. And so I always like to break it down into the three main parts of any advisory. And if you know these parts of the advisory, then you are able to talk about the advisory, to communicate about it to others, and understand what it means for you and your family as well. And so the first part is, where does the advisory apply? So we'll often provide boundaries if the advisory is for a section of a river, or it'll be for a reservoir or lake. What fish are included in the advisory? We'll recommend either categories of fish to be included or species of fish. And then how many of those fish that are included under the advisory are safe and healthy to eat. We'll give this recommendation in a term of like meals per month. It's always odd because meals is like, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so what OHA generally says is that a meal is a piece of fish that's the size and thickness of your hand. So that's why I have my little hand on the slide there. And that allows for meal sizes to scale for the size of a person, right? You can have an ounce of fish for a meal that's for an adult and for a child. So we would say like 8 ounces for an adult and 4 ounces for a child. But adults and children come in a lot of different sizes. And so that's why we always recommend using the hand. An important term to know when we're talking about advisories are resident fish. And these are species that live their entire lives in one section of the river. They don't like to travel. They don't like to go to the ocean. They are homebodies and kind of live in their territories that they've established in areas of a river or a lake. Examples of these types of species would be like carp, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, crappie, walleye. And we talk about resident fish because these are the category of fish that are most often contaminated if there's pollution present in a river or any type of water body. And this is because they're spending their entire lives near that polluted, contaminated sediment. And so they intake higher levels of that contamination. And so oftentimes an advisory will apply to the resident fish of that area. On the flip side, we have migratory fish, which are what they sound like, right? These are fish species that migrate to the ocean. They spend some of their lives in the river. Often they'll spawn or reproduce in the rivers and then migrate to the ocean. Migration distances can vary depending on the species, but some examples of these would be the salmon, steelhead, and shad. And we always like to point to migratory fish because these are the healthy options and safe choices to consume that we like to present to people in each advisory. Because the species are migrating, they're not spending as much time in contact or exposed to the pollution in the sediment. And so because of this, they often have much, much lower levels of the pollution and contaminants, and thus are safe to consume in any amount. So now that we have the context and the background for the advisory and the advisory terms, I always like to start off with understanding where the pollution comes from that is driving why this advisory exists. So Sarah did a wonderful job talking about the cleanup efforts happening at Armstrong Industries and went into the contaminants of concern there, which are those dioxin, furans, and arsenic. There are two other sites that DEQ is doing cleanup for in that area as well. One is the Pope and Talbot former wooden treatment facility, and the other is the Boise Cascade mill, this pulp and paper mill. And so first want to shout out DEQ's great map that they have created here and I am using for my slide. And just want to highlight the other contaminants of concern that are contributed by the Boise Cascade Mill and the Pope and Talbot treatment facility. So from Boise Cascade, that area has contributed contaminants, including those PAHs that Sarah talked about, PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls, and dioxin furans, and then PAHs also from the Pope and Talbot area. And these are the contaminants that are driving the fish advisory, and primarily the dioxin furans and PCBs. So just a bit of background on how the advisory came to be. So in 2010-2011, DEQ performed tissue sampling of biota, so the crayfish and clams, as well as bass in various areas of the Multnomah Channel and Scappoose Bay as part of their cleanup efforts. At the time, and until August, when this new program was created, OHA didn't have a fish advisory program, and so we relied on data from other agencies to evaluate and make fish advisories from that. So DEQ kindly shared their data with OHA, but at the time, OHA reviewed the data to determine whether there needed to be a new advisory. There was an existing advisory for the Willamette River that was issued in 1997. And so when they reviewed this data from 2010, initially OHA staff decided that the current Willamette River advisory was protective enough of human health, and there was not a need to issue a new advisory. In the next year, OHA actually updated their standard guidance for developing fish advisories. This was to better align the guidance with some new toxicological methods that were coming out that were a little more up to date and better aligned with the new guidance coming out of EPA. And it also took into account a new method in calculating meal recommendations that accounted for the additive effects of PCBs and mercury. PCBs and mercury have similar effects on human health. And so there was a new method that came out in that time that if you're consuming both contaminants and both are having similar effects, it might change the meal recommendation for certain advisories. And so because of this change in the guidance, OHA embarked on this new effort to reevaluate all their existing fish advisories and meal recommendations for all the advisories throughout the state. That took a while, but as part of this process, they reevaluated that data from DEQ, that 2010-2011 data, and that reevaluation resulted in the realization that a new separate fish advisory was needed for Multnomah Channel and Scappoose Bay, and OHA officially issued that in winter of 2020. So these are the specifics of the Multnomah Channel Scappoose Bay advisory. Thankfully, this is a limit advisory, not a do not eat. So there's still, OHA recommends that there's still a safe level of consumption for fish in the channel and the bay. OHA recommends that folks limit consumption of resident fish. So there's that term again. And you can see here on the flyer that species included here are the ones that there were data for from that DEQ sampling effort. But OHA's recommendation is that the limit applies to all resident fish present in Scappoose Bay and the Multnomah Channel. The limit recommendation also includes sturgeon, which OHA actually has a separate advisory for, and then crayfish and clams. I do want to highlight that freshwater clams and mussels are illegal to harvest for anyone other than tribal members that have harvesting rights for freshwater mussels and clams. They're included in the advisory because to provide guidance for tribal members who have these harvesting rights, and also because we recognize that some people may not follow that law, but we still want them to be safe and protect their health. We also highlight safe fish choices, so those migratory fish, the salmon, shad, and steelhead. We recommend please consume. They're good for you. They're good for local tribal economies to purchase your salmon, shad, and steelhead from them. Yeah, so that's that healthy choice box you see in the flyer there. I also want to highlight, like Sarah said, we are developing materials for this advisory kind of as we go. And so we would love feedback from community groups, from you all at Scappoose Bay Watershed Council about what is the best way to present this information. And yeah, would love feedback from you all on that. I also want to highlight that the main contaminant of concern that is driving these recommendations are those PCBs, or those polychlorinated biphenyls. These are some tables pulled from our technical reports. To the left, you see the table from the Sturgeon Advisory Technical Report. It's highlighting that only 1 meal per month is recommended for all people. So this includes pregnant women, people that are pregnant people that are nursing, and children, and then also for people that don't fall into that category. So 1 meal per month for sturgeon. And that's because sturgeon they're really old, they can be, and large, and they have a lot of fats. And so they're very good at accumulating those PCBs like I highlighted. The table to the right has a lot of information, so I just want to highlight that. It highlights the contaminant that's driving the meal recommendation for each fish species. I want to call out that the meal recommendation for the smallmouth bass applies to, again, all those resident fish. We have recommendations for if you're just consuming the fillet for the general population, which is what that GP stands for, and then also for vulnerable populations, which again is those people that are pregnant, may become pregnant, or small children. And then we have also recommendations for if folks are consuming the whole body of the fish. The meal recommendation drastically changes because when people consume the whole body of the fish, they're exposed to much higher levels of the contaminant present in the fish. And so that's why that meal recommendation is much lower, is that 1 meal per month. OHA has shifted to mainly basing advisory meal recommendations off of whole body consumption because that's the most health protective. And we know that certain cultures or groups prefer to consume whole body of the fish. You can access these tables and information about the advisory, including the technical reports that go into more detail at our website. So healthoregon.org/fish advisory. So who is most at risk? The exposed populations are going to be anyone who eats resident fish from the Multnomah Channel in Scappoose Bay. But I want to call out again that vulnerable group, which are those childbearing people, babies, infants, anyone that is feeding those babies and infants, and young children. We call that out on the materials. So the on the right bottom corner, that's from that flyer that we developed, calling out that these are the people that are most at risk. And so we want to make sure that everybody understands that these are the people that are most at risk, because we all have neighbors and families and are able to pass information to people. The reason why we call out these specific groups are because this primary contaminant that is driving most of the health risk is, again, those PCBs. And PCBs are fat loving, so what we call lipophilic. They build up in animals' fatty tissues. And during pregnancy, fats are mobilized and are passed to the fetus in utero, and then during breastfeeding, they're passed to the infant through the breast milk. And so when those PCBs build up in the fatty tissues of the fish, and then people consume that fish, they are intaking those chemicals and those contaminants. And I want to also highlight that on the materials, when we say may become pregnant, that can be a little confusing sometimes. People might think, oh, that's just if I'm planning on conceiving in the next year or in the next couple months. Unfortunately, PCBs have a really long, what we call half-life, which means that they can exist in the body for a really long time. And so when we talk about may become pregnant, a young child that consumes the PCBs, if they grow up and conceive a child, could have those same PCBs in their body as an adult when they conceive. Unfortunately, this results in there being this intergenerational effect and passing of chemicals between generations. And so that's why when we say may become pregnant, it's anyone who could become pregnant at any point in their life. So this obviously applies to a bunch of different people. And even if you don't fall into one of those categories, you probably know somebody that does. And so that's why we try to really drive this point home. And the reason for this is because the health effects associated with PCBs are not great. So PCBs can cause lifelong learning and behavior problems. They disrupt the neurodevelopmental processes, is kind of the main thing that they do, which is why they're so destructive for, babies in utero who are developing all those important systems, and then also infants, small children. These humans are undergoing really rapid levels and times of development. And so when they're exposed to PCBs during those times, it can have serious problems. PCBs can also cause immune system issues, thyroid problems, reproductive system issues, cancer, and then just highlighting again in infants that neurodevelopmental disruption and immune system problems. I always like to ask people, how can you tell if a fish is bad to eat? Common answers that I get are, it will be deformed, it'll look weird, it'll smell bad, it'll have tumors. Those are all great thoughts. Unfortunately, with the contaminants that we talk about with this advisory, you will not be able to tell if the fish is contaminated or not. Even if you know the fishery really well, even if you've been fishing there your entire life, you just can't tell if there's PCBs in the fish by looking at it. And so we always say the best way you can tell if a fish is bad to eat is to know about your local fish advisories and to know where they apply, what fish they apply to, and how many are safe to consume. I also want to recognize that some folks may need to consume fish to subsist and to live, and those fish may be some of the fish we recommend limiting consumption of. If folks do need to eat these fish, there's some safe cleaning and cooking methods that we recommend that can reduce the amount of contaminant that you're exposed to. So the safe cleaning methods, because those PCBs love fats, any fat that you can remove off the fish is going to reduce the amount of PCBs you're exposed to. So that would be removing the skin, removing the fat areas on the back and the belly and the sides, and then cooking the fish in a way, broiling, grilling, baking, or steaming, that you allow the fats to drip off of the fish, and then you discard those fat drippings. This can reduce the amount of PCBs in the fish by about 50%. So this is a really great trick, especially for people that rely on this fishery, to live. So the key thing is to just know where your fish comes from, and know if there are any local advisories in your area. I always like to end with reiterating that resident fish advisory is not a permanent solution, but just this stopgap while Sarah does her great work to clean up these sites, and just a necessary measure right now to protect public health. It's always tricky talking about fish consumption because we have to balance like the benefits of eating fish, but also making sure people know what fish they may need to limit their consumption of in terms of this specific advisory. And so, like Sarah said, at OHA, we would love feedback and your knowledge of the community about like, what's the best way to communicate about this advisory in the specific community? It changes with every advisory in every town and every location. And so, yeah, we really rely on y'all with the community knowledge to have that expertise and to partner with us to get the word out about this advisory. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you, Megan. That was a really excellent presentation.
Megan, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I definitely feel like this is like really important information for anyone and everyone to know, especially just how many anglers we have in Columbia County. What kind of
Yeah.
outreach, what type of outreach do you guys do? What does that look like for y'all?
Yes. So, as I mentioned before, this program is new at OHA. So prior to the creation of the program in August, when I was hired to take it on, there was no staff or resources or funding dedicated to doing outreach. It was limited to reviewing those data sets that other agencies may have shared with OHA and then issuing advisories. And that was kind of it for what resources and capacity allowed OHA staff to do. But now that I'm here and I have a whole program that's a part of like the base state budget now, which is super exciting. So we now have the capacity to do the outreach. So that's something Sarah and I are kind of trying to figure out is what does appropriate outreach for the Multnomah Channel Scappoose Bay advisory look like? What's going to speak to your community most? What are the areas of trusted, like locations and hubs of trusted information? So it looks like, we want to develop signs and would love to work with you on like, what should the sign look like? Where should the signs go? For other advisories, we'll train community health workers about the advisory. We'll do we can have done train the trainer formats. So for community health workers, but could be for anybody else that you think would be great to be trained and then be a trusted source of information in the community. Distribution of like flyers and materials at libraries and things like that. But again, we're developing those materials now. And so we would love your feedback and input about, what those materials should include and what they should look like.
Absolutely, that's great to hear. And I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but I'm also with the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, so I think I speak for Rochelle as well. But I think we'd be happy to provide any input and get those out into the community in collaboration
That'd
with
be
you guys.
awesome.
So that's fantastic to hear. Thank you.
Sweet, thank you.
Yeah, I would also be willing to play a part in that. I mean, I already do outreach as a part of my job, and you'll probably find out that part of that is mercury, so fish consumption too. So yeah, I can play a part.
That'd be awesome. Thank you all. You will be hearing from me.
And with that, I think that that leads really nicely into your presentation, Nolan.
Okay. Let's get started then. Okay, so I am Nolan Cochran, the TMDL program coordinator for Columbia County and the city of St. Helens. I split my time between the two because they have separate TMDLs assigned to them. I am an AmeriCorps Rare member, so I'm placed here for 11 months through the end of July, and I am sponsored by the Department of Environmental Quality. And today I'm going to talk about water quality in Columbia County, the problems we're trying to address, and what a TMDL is. So TMDL program was established in 1972 by the Clean Water Act. Basically, streams and water bodies have a designated amount of pollutant that they're allowed to have before they exceed the limit. Once they exceed the limit, they are put on a 303D list and assigned a total maximum daily load. This requires the management agency, the city, county, or something else to create a plan to address this pollutant of concern. They have to submit it to the Department of Environmental Quality, get it approved, and then implement their plan and do yearly check-ins. The Clean Water Act also established the National Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System, which regulates point source pollution. And that plays a role in some of the things I'm going to talk about and is part of TMDL. So the first TMDL that affected Columbia County was in 2006 when DEQ issued a TMDL for the entire Willamette Basin, of which the Scappoose Bay Watershed is a part, just in the southeastern part of the county here. You can see it matches up with the very top of the Willamette Basin. So we were responsible for the mercury portion of that original TMDL. And in 2019, the DEQ revised and replaced their 2006 TMDL, and they noted that we still have an 89% reduction needed to meet their water quality goals. So we have a long ways to go in reducing mercury pollution. In 2017, the Soil and Water Conservation District started a long-term water quality monitoring program. And in their report in 2020, they identified temperature, E. coli bacteria, and dissolved oxygen were also exceeding the, the regulated limit. And then we were assigned a temperature TMDL in 2022 and 2024, and we're going to be submitting it in the spring. And the last 2 years, they did an eDNA study, so testing where the E. coli bacteria was sourced from, and they found an average of 68% human contribution. And then other notable sources were dogs and poultry. And this is the watersheds that they tested in. So the Scappoose Bay watersheds down here, and then some of the other ones across the county. And then the circles on there are where they tested. So you can see there was a lot of testing points around the St. Helens area and the Milton and McNulty Creek. So we know that we have temperature, mercury, and E. coli pollution in the county, and I'm going to talk about where they come from and why we don't want them. So mercury occurs naturally in the environment. It is found in soil and minerals and also fossil fuels. And when you burn fossil fuels, that mercury can be released into the atmosphere, travel any distance, and then be deposited back onto the land surface. And then from there, it can end up in streams. Since mercury is found in the soil when erosion happens and sedimentation occurs, and that those soils get washed into streams, that can also be a source of mercury in streams. And then there's other inputs like some household devices like thermometers or thermostats have mercury in them. So if those don't get disposed of properly, They can lead to mercury pollution, and then also dental offices use mercury, so those have to be regulated as well. The DEQ in 2019 report, they estimated that 32% of the mercury in our streams comes from atmospheric deposition and 43% comes from erosion and sedimentation. So those are the big areas that we try to hone in on when we talk about actually reducing the amount of mercury in streams. This is part of the fish advisory, but mercury is negative because of a process called bioaccumulation, which means that when you have mercury in a stream, the fish pick it up in their body tissue, and when you eat the fish, that can become in your tissue and cause multiple negative effects. Temperature pollution, a lot of times, temperature might not be thought of as a pollutant, but temperature becomes a pollutant when it changes the natural temperature in the stream to a point that it affects the ecosystem and the fish and the microorganisms living in the stream. The sources of temperature pollution are decreased shade. So when we chop down trees for farmland or for development, it decreases the amount of shade that's on the streams, therefore increasing the temperature. Big factories, mills, energy producing plants all use water to cool down their machinery. And when that now heated water is released into streams, that can be an input of heated water. These are regulated through the NPDES program that I mentioned in the beginning, controlling point source. So any factory or industrial facility that wants to discharge to a stream has to first get a permit, and they have to follow the rules. Usually that's having some way to reduce the temperature of the water before it gets discharged. Also, stormwater is a source of temperature pollution because concrete holds higher temperatures than soil or vegetation does. So when you have water running over these surfaces like concrete and roofs and things like that, it can become more heated than the stream water and therefore contribute to temperature pollution. In addition to disrupting cold water species, particularly their reproductive cycle, higher water temperature also is more favorable for algae blooms to happen, um, which decrease the dissolved oxygen in the stream. When they die and bacteria start to decompose the algae, they suck up all the oxygen in the stream. And warmer water also just holds less dissolved oxygen in the first place. So temperature pollution not only disrupts the life cycles in the first place of cold water species, but also leads to less dissolved oxygen, which can also be harmful for fish species. And then we have E. coli bacteria. Since the majority of it was human sourced, we can pretty much assume that that comes from failing septic systems in the county. Um, if septic systems should be replaced every 30 years or so, and before the 1970s, there weren't even regulations or rules around installing septic systems, so they might have always been, releasing fecal matter into streams. And the thing with E. coli is not all E. coli cause diseases. Some of it causes mild, some of it causes severe, but really it's a red flag that indicates that there's some kind of contamination getting in the stream. And with E. coli, there can be a lot of other dangerous bacteria and pathogens in the stream. So it's something that we want to address. It can also come from livestock and dogs. So the mechanism that gets these pollutants that we're talking about from where they are into streams is oftentimes stormwater. So we have concrete holding temperature right here. We have pets relieving themselves in yards, mercury being deposited from the atmosphere. This could be oil leaks from a car. We could have people spraying their lawns with pesticide. You could have any number of pollutants and that's associated with human activity in the city, paint leaking, stuff like that. And then also nutrients that we spray on plants, fertilizer. All of this stuff, when it rains, gets washed off our cities, off our land surfaces, and straight into streams. In addition to any erosion that happens, washing sediment into streams, which is not only pollution in and of itself, but also creates more mercury. So when we try to address these pollutants, we're oftentimes trying to address stormwater and erosion control. So stormwater is the result of impervious surfaces and saturated soils. So whenever it rains, some of the water coming down from the sky directly infiltrates the soil where it lands and ends up as groundwater. Any water that can't do that ends up running over the surface of the land and becomes stormwater. And in cities, when humans develop land, we greatly increase the amount of stormwater that occurs on that land because we put what's called impervious surfaces, or surfaces that don't allow water to flow through them and into the ground. So things like streets, driveways, any concrete, buildings, even cars, all of these things increase the amount of stormwater that occurs when it rains. And in cities, we have storm drains. We have a sewer system for stormwater that's separate than the sanitary sewer system. And a common misconception could be that, people might think that the water going into storm drains receives treatment before being discharged to streams, but that's actually not the case. Stormwater is not treated at all oftentimes and is discharged directly into streams. So anything that goes into those storm drains in your neighborhood goes directly into streams. It doesn't receive treatment like the sanitary sewer system does. So, what are we doing about these problems? The aspects of the TMDL are public education and engagement, so things like this and other events that I do. We do enforcement of prohibited pollutants, so making sure people aren't discharging things into storm drains. And then there's a lot of erosion control and stormwater management that we do as well. So, what urban stormwater management typically looks like is we have our storm drains. As a part of our TMDL, we clean them once a year. We try to include every stormwater input. We also clean our street with street sweepers. We track the amount of miles and submit those to DEQ every year. And then there's also this new push for what's commonly called low impact development whenever we do a new construction project. So something that is being incorporated into a lot of engineering manuals and things like that these days are when you do a development that is going to increase the amount of stormwater coming off of a property because you're adding impervious surfaces, you also might have to install something to treat that stormwater before it even reaches the stormwater sewer system. So this right here is actually a picture I took in St. Helens on Gable Road, where we have a bioswale or a bioretention facility. But how this works is when it rains, water that comes off of the development over here or comes off of the street is allowed to flow into the facility here through these low cut curbs. And then this is a engineered soil with plants to design to have the maximum amount of infiltration into the soil as possible before it even has to drain into the storm drain here. And it's a little hard to see, but usually these storm drains are elevated a little above the surface to allow as much water as possible to go into the ground before it has to go into the storm drain. Another, version of this is called a rain garden. This is, once again, the plants and soil in here is engineered to have the maximum amount of infiltration into the soil. And you can see the elevated storm drain there as well. So usually they calculate for, how big of a storm they're trying to manage. And they say, okay, that's how high we want to put this storm drain before we want water actually going into the storm drain instead of going into the soil. Sometimes if you're doing a really big development, you'll actually put a stormwater pond on your site where the local, stormwater inputs will actually drain into the pond instead of draining into a local stream. And this allows time for water, sediment to settle out of the water and different pollutants to be filtered before water has to reach streams. Another thing that we are trying to address and part of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System is erosion control on construction sites. So construction sites and construction activity increases the potential for erosion because you're removing vegetation and you're digging. And vegetation is the best way to prevent erosion from occurring for multiple reasons. And now when you've removed all this vegetation and it rains, more erosion is going to occur. So nationally, if you have a construction site that disturbs 1 or more acres of soil, you're required to get a permit for erosion control. And in Oregon, that goes through DEQ and is called the 1200C permit. This is what happens when companies ignore the erosion control requirements. This was on a construction site in Alabama where they didn't have the proper best management practices in place. It rained and they lost several tons of topsoil from their property, which cost them over $1 million in fines. Part of my project this year with TMDL is we're creating a new local permit for sites that disturb 1,000 square feet and up to 1 acre where it gets taken over by the DEQ permit. So we're going to be requiring anyone disturbing 1,000 square feet to submit an erosion and sediment control plan to the city. And they're going to be talking in that plan, they'll be required to use best management practices to reduce the amount of erosion and sediment being discharged from their site and entering either our stormwater sewer system or local water bodies. Common best management practices are perimeter control with sediment fences to control water flowing off the site. If you have soil that's disturbed and you're not going to work on it for 2 weeks or more, you're required to cover it during that time, protect it from erosion occurring. Stormwater input protection. If you're going to be discharging to the Milton or McNulty Creek, which are both 303D listed, you're going to be required to have a natural or vegetated buffer left between the creek and your project, if possible. And then you're always required to revegetate any land that was disturbed during the construction process. We also have an illicit discharge detection and elimination system in St. Helens. So it is illegal to dump anything besides stormwater, just about, into our stormwater sewer system. Um, and we are asking anyone who observes this occurring, who observes the potential for this to occur, to report it to the city. There's a hotline, there's a way to file a report on the website if you just look up illicit discharge detection and elimination in the city. And we would greatly appreciate that because we're trying to work on our response and our ability to enforce these rules. The county also has several programs to prevent pollution. They have a dump stoppers program where if you observe something that looks like this on the county right of way or on public land, you can report it to the county and they will send a crew out to clean it up. They also have household hazardous waste collection events, and they just released the 2025 dates for those. So there's 7 different dates between March and October at different points at different places in the county where they will dispose of for free any, toxic chemicals, paints, fluids, oils, things like that that you can't just throw in the garbage. Um, so that's a easy way to get rid of those things, and it's free of charge, super easy. So it's a great service provided by the county. E. coli, the community action team here did have a grant through the end of 2024 to help with septic repairs if you had already had an inspection, because it can be expensive to do that. Unfortunately, the grant they can't accept new applications. They are doing a wait list in case the DEQ gives them a new grant to help more people, and hopefully that will happen. But if your drainage system looks like this, if it's smelly, then it's definitely time to get it inspected and to try and address this problem. Also, we ask you to pick up after your dogs, even if you're walking in a park where you might think it'll just decompose. It's a natural area, it's not like it's on someone's yard. The parks can't handle the amount of dogs that are walking in there before it rains. When it rains, all of that is going to get washed into the creek that runs through the park. So we definitely ask you to pick up after your pets, keep your livestock away from streams, or don't let, where they are be directly uphill of a stream. And then, stream and land restoration is very important, and we're really thankful to have the Cochran Watershed Council and the Soil and Water Conservation District to do those every single year, and I encourage people to volunteer and to, if you have a stream running through your private property and you're worried about erosion or water quality in that stream, there are, Scappoose Bay Watershed Council can help you out and potentially do a project on your property. So that's everything. Do we have questions?
Thank you, Nolan. I had one question about the new permit that you were speaking about. Was that within the city of St. Helens jurisdiction, or was that for the Columbia County overall for the permit that was from 1,000 feet to 1 acre?
Yeah, that's just for the city of St. Helens. Columbia County actually already requires, I think I'm not, it is 1,000 square feet already on when there's like known erosion problems. I'm not actually sure what it is for like
Mhm.
the standard, but they already have it below 1 acre. But that new permit will just be for the city.
Okay. Well, several of these permits, when we're doing this restoration along the streams, we have to receive as well. So that I was just curious.
Hmm.
With that coming down the pipeline, it might be something we may need to obtain in the future.
Yeah, we're trying to make it low barrier. Yeah.
Were there any other questions?
I have a question. What does you talked about like community outreach and education activities related to the TMDLs, and I was just curious what those look like.
Yeah, I've been working with the school districts here mostly. I like to go to like high school classes or elementaries, and I mean with the high schoolers, I do a presentation pretty similar to what I just showed you guys. With elementary kids, I'll do more like water cycle stuff like that. I've also been trying to get on the list for some tabling events in the spring. Tomorrow, I'm actually taking a high school class out to tour a construction site and see some of like the erosion control they've got going on there. So mostly I've been working with the school districts, but I, still have like 6 months left. So
Yeah,
have a
and
long
if
ways
you
to go.
need any tabling ideas, we can definitely touch base, or there are several events that we're at. So if you want to just partner up and take up like a section of our table, we could probably work something out too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I thought your presentation was really like approachable and informative. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And like there's always a need for more outreach on these topics, I think. But you mentioned your position goes through July. Is that going to be converted to permanent, or is there kind of a plan for this work post July? No.
No. Well, I mean, it's possible. I haven't talked with my supervisors about that. I will be definitely looking for jobs related to water quality across the state. Um, there's never been a TMDL program coordinator for either Columbia or, Columbia County or the city, so I'm not sure what the plan is after that. I do know my AmeriCorps program just started this partnership with DEQ to have TMDL implementation assistance. There's 5 of us this year, and I think it goes for the next like 5 years. There's going to be
Oh,
positions across the state. So, yeah.
well, I always love to advocate for making these positions permanent. I know it's hard. So, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I'll ask if there's any more questions for any of our presenters before we log off for the evening. Well, and oh, Nicole.
Oh, I was just going to say I really appreciated getting the updates on the Scappoose Bay projects and hearing about the work that's going around along about fish and working in the construction industry. I deal with stormwater quite frequently, and it's exciting to see the education and advocacy that's going on there as well. So thank you all for your work. And I think that, Rochelle and Brendan have both said that the Watershed Council is very much looking forward to contributing to and working with your various programs in the future. So please stay in touch.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank all of you presenters. Keep in touch, and also we will get this uploaded to our YouTube and out on our socials. But once we do that, then you guys will also be able. We'll send you the link, and you guys can also get it up on any of your socials or websites, or out to any of your other partners. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.